My name is Ron Wheeler. I'll be presenting the literary perspective on ethics today. Levin has an interesting observation in his book on Christian ethics, and he writes, "People learn deontological ethics in natural and moral law by experience, by bumping up against the limits of their human capacities, or by learning how to have to behave and to get along with their neighbors. Proverbs, fables, and rules are passed from one generation to the next, but usually with the wry sense that no matter how cleverly the elders put it, each generation has to make its own mistakes and learn this wisdom for itself." In literature, we need to think about the power of literary expression. It's very interesting that even though philosophy may be one of the most engaged and time-honored way of looking at the world, the expression of its conclusions often find a literary expression. And when we are really trying to communicate to someone else, we often frame that communication in the form of story. In story, you have three primary components, and the difference between a narrative and a story really boils down to one of these components. But let's think about the three components first. First of all, you have to think about who is doing the action of the story. And these would be the characters. Then you have to think about what is taking place, and this would be the plot. But finally, and most important, we think about why does this take place? Why does the story take place? And that leads us to the term conflict. For without conflict, you never have story. Now, in the course of your working through your case studies, one of the most helpful ways of examining and breaking down the elements is to look at those three components. The who that's involved in the decision-making process, the what is the decision hopefully going to give us, and then why is this decision necessary? And then as you break that down, when you come to your presentation, either in the group presentation before your peers or even in the poster presentation, you need to think about the literary expression. How am I going to capture this story, this progression of conflict, and what we have done to help resolve that conflict? That resolution needs expression through language. Now, language has essentially three areas of expression. The literary use of language, the one that we're most comfortable with, usually in everyday discussion, simply gives us information. I'm going to Walmart. I need to pick up some shampoo. What time is your philosophy class today? This is exchange of information. It's the information of journalism. It's the information often of just textbooks. Another way that language works is through persuasion, and we are bombarded with the hortatory use of language every day. It comes to us most often in the form of commercials. Someone trying to get you to pull your billfold out and spend your money. But it also comes in terms of the lectern, where the professor is trying to get you to buy into a concept or an idea. And we at Johnson are most familiar with it in chapel, where from the pulpit, someone is trying to convince us to do something with our lives or for other people or for the kingdom's sake. This is the use of language as persuasion. That leaves us with one other use, the literary use. Now, the literary use of language is simply the expression of the human experience. It's not telling someone about an experience that you've had, nor is it trying to convince someone about something of the experience you've had. Rather, when it works well, The literary use of language is actually giving your audience the experience itself. Now, you can well imagine that such a high endeavor is very difficult. And most creatives, whether they work in words of fiction or poetry or drama, they fully recognize that they will fail to give all, or even maybe most, of their audience the experience that they're trying to capture. But when they do, when that communication of experience connects between a creator and the audience, there's no other expression of language, not information, not persuasion, that quite moves us in the way that literature does. This is a great power. It's that power in literature that Lovin references when he talks about the old generation trying to pass on wisdom to the new generation. I had a colleague at Kentucky Christian, where I went to my undergraduate work, and she was fond of pointing out that every generation thinks that it, and it alone, has invented sex and alcohol. And of course, if you would just pause for a moment and consider that, you would realize that most of us here owe our very existence to one or maybe both of those conditions. How do we get the next generation or the ones after us to understand our own experiences? Part of that comes with the dimensions of literary language. First, what does literary language focus on? And this probably remains the most significant part of this presentation. What it focuses upon is the human experience. And what it gives us, or how it focuses on that human experience, is in memorable words. Not just the words, but the way that the words work together, the way that they form sentences, and the way the sentences form paragraphs, or the way those sentences and words form verses or strophes in poetry, or the way they form scenes in drama. And how does it bond together? That is, what is the synthesis in the literary use of language? What it bonds are two things. It bonds a breadth of experience with a depth of experience. Most of us have an understanding of winter. People north of the Mason-Dixon line, they don't need a depth of experience necessarily. They understand from their own winter after winter what cold is like, snow, ice, and sleet. But they might need a breadth of experience. What does winter look like to somebody in East Tennessee or North Georgia? And that breadth, that transfer of experience, is what the literary use of language can help with. And finally, literary use of language offers us discernment. It is a way of understanding the world around us. Just like philosophers look for patterns, the creative looks to take that pattern, that discernment, and then express it in such a way that from the words themselves, someone can understand the pattern from a second point of view. So, what are the dimensions of the power of literary use of language? Power is an interesting thing. In physics, there is a formula, P equals W over T, where power equals work through time. I'd like to adapt that formula to talk about the power of literary language, where P equals I over T. That is, power equals influence over time. The more words influence an audience through a longer amount of time, the greater the literary power. Now, you might think great works of literature like the Iliad and the Odyssey are the best exemplars of literary power. for they have influenced cultures through time. But on a personal level, let me make an observation, and let me do it with a story. Once upon a time, there was a little girl, and her hair was as golden as the sun, and it curled in ringlets down her back. And because it did, everyone called her Goldilocks. Now, Goldilocks took a walk in the woods one day, and just off of the path, she saw a little cabin with a door slightly ajar. So she walked down the path, and she pushed the door open, looked inside, and there she saw 3 chairs. There was a great big chair, a medium-sized chair, and a small chair. Well, and you know the rest of the story, how Goldilocks threw the chairs and the porridge and then into the beds, basically comes in and takes over the house of the 3 bears. They come home, discover this vandalism, and depending upon the version that you're looking at, this little tale has quite an interesting ending. If you're looking at the Mother Goose or even Disney version of this story, Goldilocks wakes up and she either flees the house or she is made to give some kind of restitution for the damage that she has done. Now, in the original Grimm's tales, the bears eat her up. Some lessons are very, very hard to learn. But think of all of the details of the story, Goldilocks and the 3 bears. How long has it been since you've read that fairy tale? For that matter, have you even read that fairy tale? Do you simply remember it consciously here into your young adulthood from the times that your parents and that your teachers or your siblings or your friends would talk about this fairy tale? And think about some of the underlying issues in this story, the warnings that this story gives. Well, first of all, think about fairy tales as a general form, as a genre. One of the most dangerous things that anyone can do is go into the woods alone. Think of how many of these stories warn against the bad things that happen in the woods because there are bears out there, there are wolves out there, there are witches out there. So you have to be careful about going into the woods. And if you're living in medieval Germany, and you're living up against a primeval forest, one of the greatest warnings your parents could instill in you is don't go into the woods alone, because you might not make it out. Now, if we would transfer that warning into a modern idiom, we might be warning our children about another woods where predators are all over the place. The mall. Don't go to the mall alone. Be careful who you talk to. So the conditions of warning for safety's sake remain the same. But the fact that we remember these stories and remember them in such great detail, it attests to the power that is the influence over time of these stories and how they have definitely affected us. Ultimately, literature informs the mind. It gives us information and pieces to tie to our realities. But it also touches the heart. It connects with us in an emotional way that memory is able to access. And most important, probably from this triad, it challenges our behavior. Will we be like those people in the story? Or will we make other decisions that they have made in their conflict? And how would we work through those decisions in a way, and what would those decisions look like? One of the greatest advantages of a literary perspective relative to ethics is to discover that people have been facing challenges and choices across a time spectrum and across cultural spectrums. That the ultimate need to choose remains very fundamental and very old. And literature allows us, if you will, a case study or a laboratory to test certain decisions, to see what might be the results without actually having to pay the price of those decisions, either in blood or in loss. Let's run through another little poem, this one by James Whitcomb Riley. It's called Little Orphan Annie. Now, the speaker of this poem is one of the children that the central character, Little Orphan Annie, tells stories to. I'm going to recite this, and as I do, listen for the experiences that Annie is transferring to her audience. Little Orphan Annie has come to our house to stay, to wash the cups and saucers up and brush the crumbs away, to shoo the chickens off the porch, to dust the hearth and sweep, to make the fire and bake the bread and earn her board and keep. And all us other children, when supper things is done, we sit around the kitchen fire and has the mostest fun, a-listening to the witch tales that Annie tells about and the goblins that get you if you don't watch out. Once there was a little boy who wouldn't say his prayers, and when he went to bed at night away upstairs, his mammy heard him holler and his daddy heard him bawl, and when they'd turned the kivers down, he wasn't there at all. They seeked him in the rafter room, in cubbyhole and press. They seeked him up the chimney flue and everywheres, I guess, but all they ever found were his pants and roundabouts. And the goblins will get you if you don't watch out. And once there was a little girl who'd always laugh and grin and make fun of everyone and all her blood and kin. And once, when they was company and old folks was there, she mocked them and she shocked them and she said she didn't care. And just as she clicked her heels and turned to run and hide, there were two great big black things a-standing by her side. And they snatched her through the ceiling, for she knowed what she's about. And the goblins will get you if you don't watch out. And little Orphan Annie says, when the blaze is blue and the lamp wick sputters and the wind goes, ooh, you'd better mind your parents and your teachers, fond and dear, and help the poor and needy one and dry the orphan's tear and cherishes them that loves you, if you know what you're about, or the goblins will get you if you don't watch out. Now, in this little story, ostensibly, on the first level of experience, children should mind. That is, they should do what they're told. They should follow the rules of the house. They should respect their elders. That much would be clear across the board. But there's a secondary meaning. There is a use of this experience to soften up Annie's audience, to get them to empathize with her concerning her own condition. Remember how the poem starts out? Little Orphan Annie, this girl without means of support, has come to our house to stay. And what's she do? She bakes, she cleans, and then after she's had her day of work, she sits around and has to take care of the children. So she tells them these stories. And at the end, you can almost hear the plead in Annie's voice. You'd better mind your parents and your teachers, fond and dear. That much we could understand very clearly from what goblins would do. But then the next line, and help to dry the orphan's tear. Who's the orphan? It's Annie. She's making a plea on her own behalf. A plea for help, respect, inclusion. These are very fundamental human observations. Fundamental in that these are the things that we want. These are the things that we try to solve, to put our world right. And in this little story, Annie is trying to put her world right by hopefully instilling in her audience good choices that they should make. In the end, there are two underlying questions regarding all literary analysis and approach. And these two questions, therefore, would be very applicable to any consideration of ethical concerns. The first question, what does it mean to be human? This is a point of identity. When we speak of ourselves, when we speak of others, have we come to a fundamental understanding of our own human condition? What are the influences on that condition? What are the reasonable responses to those conditions? And what are we trying to do to set things right if those conditions are out of kilter? The second question, and maybe even the more important, what human experience does this work present? That simply is the question of life. What experience, what tension, what conflict has taken place that have brought these elements and these people together in this crisis situation? What dilemma exists that they must make a choice between good, bad, good and a better good, or a bad and an evil? These are part of the ethical dilemma. These are part of the case study inquiry that we will need to make as this course goes along. I'm Ron Wheeler, and that's been the literary perspective on ethics.